The Forgotten Engineer. A story of faith, ingenuity, and divine providence. The man nobody noticed. The morning mist clung to the English coast like a shroud, and Lieutenant Colonel James Hardwell stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the channel, watching the preparations for Operation Overlord wheat growing dread. It was June 4th, 1944, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the horizon lay Normandy, and the greatest military operation in human history. Hardwell's mind turned to the words of Psalm 118, unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. He had read those words countless times since his arrival in England, and they seemed to grow more prophetic with each passing day. In the shadows of the massive military infrastructure sprawling across the southern English countryside, there worked a man whom almost no one acknowledged. His name was Samuel Sham Jackson, a tall, lean African-American engineer whose reputation preceded him in whispered conversations, the black builder with the crazy ideas. Most of the white officers dismissed him outright. Some tolerated him. Few, if any, truly listened to him. Sham had been assigned to the logistics division of the day operation, ostensibly to handle supply calculations. But in reality, he was relegated to the margins, given tasks that others considered beneath their rank or too unimportant to warrant serious attention. He spent his days in a cramped office studying maps, surveying terrain, and making observations that he tried to share with anyone who would listen. Almost no one did. The problem Sham had identified was one that kept him awake at night. The main causeway across the inundated terrain behind Ida Beach was a catastrophic bottleneck. The engineers had a plan, a solid plan by military standards. But Sham had seen something they had missed. When he tried to raise his concerns in meetings, senior officers would glance at him with polite indifference before turning back to their senior colleagues. "The colored fellow has a question," one a major had remarked, not unkindly, but with a tone that suggested questions from Sham were roughly equivalent to suggestions from a supply clerk. His detailed written reports gathered dust on desks. His sketches were filed away without proper review. If you're enjoying this story about courage against the odds, make sure to like this video and subscribe to see more incredible historical narratives that challenge everything you think you know about World War A. Sham wasn't a man to be deterred by indifference, however. His faith ran deep, deeper than the ocean separating England from France. He had grown up in rural Georgia, the son of a preacher and a schoolteacher, and he carried within him the conviction that God placed certain people in certain places for specific reasons. Perhaps, he thought, he was here for more than anyone realized. Late one evening, as he pored over the surveys and topographical maps alone in his office, an idea struck him with such force that he actually gasped. It wasn't a grand solution, but it was elegant. It was simple. It was, in fact, almost absurdly simple, so simple that the military engineers with their complex calculations and sophisticated equipment had overlooked it entirely. It involved rope. Sam's idea was born from an observation so obvious that it had become invisible to everyone trained in modern warfare and mechanized thinking. The engineering corps had planned for the causeway to be controlled with military discipline. Soldiers would advance in orderly fashion, their movement directed by officers and sergeants maintaining strict formations. The problem was that under artillery fire, inches and confusion, maintaining such formations would be nearly impossible. What if, Sham reasoned, you could guide men across the causeway without requiring them to maintain visual contact with their officers? What if a soldier could follow a simple, tactile guide even in complete darkness or under heavy bombardment? That was where the rope came in. Sam's plan was ingenious in its simplicity. This thick rope, standard Navajo rope that was already being supplied to the forces, along both sides of the causeway. Soldiers could follow these ropes by hand, moving in controlled but independent groups. They would never lose their way. They would never become disorganized. Under fire, confused, separated from their units, a soldier could still advance by simply following the rope. He drew up the plans meticulously. He calculated the load-bearing capacity of the rope under various conditions. He worked through potential failure scenarios. He even created a scale model to demonstrate the concept. Then he submitted his proposal. It was rejected. The rejection came politely enough. The commanding officer noted that the plan was interesting, but it was deemed impractical. "We don't have time for experimental methods," he wrote. Our strategy has been approved by higher command. There were, he added, concerns about the viability of untested approaches. What he didn't write, but what Sham understood perfectly, was that the plan didn't come from the right people. It came from a Negro engineer without the proper credentials or connections. It came from someone whose very presence in the room was considered unusual by some of the senior officers who had grown up in a segregated America. But Sham possessed something rarer than ambition. He possessed conviction. And his faith told him that God didn't make mistakes in where he placed his people. He began to gather all these quietly. There was Lieutenant Thomas Kirkwood, a young officer from Boston who had heard Sam's presentation and actually found it compelling. There was Major David Rothstein, a Jewish logistics officer who had experienced enough prejudice himself to recognize it in others. And there was Sergeant Marcus Webb, a veteran of North Africa who had enough sense to trust practical solutions over rank. Together, they began to prepare the rope system in secret, working late into the nights. They positioned supplies. They tested the rigging. They prepared for a contingency that no one in the official command structure had authorized them to prepare for. On June 5th, the final orders came down. The invasion would proceed at dawn on June 12th. The weather had broken. The time had come. This is exactly the kind of hidden history that deserves to be shared. Leave a comment below telling me, what historical figures do you think have been unfairly forgotten or dismissed? Your stories matter. Sham knelt in prayer that night. He opened his worn Bible and read from Proverbs 10:5 June, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways submit to him and you'll make your path straight. He understood now why he had been placed in this position. Not to be praised. Not to receive recognition. Simply to be faithful with what God had given him. The thunder of artillery woke Sham before dawn on June 12th. He made his way to his assigned position near the command post overlooking Native Beach, watching as the first waves of landing craft approached the shore. The noise was indescribable, a wall of sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. The first waves went ashore successfully, though not without cost. The second wave encountered heavier fire. By the time the third wave was approaching, the beach below was a hellscape of smoke, flames, and confusion. Men who had trained for months found themselves facing a reality that no training could truly prepare you for. But they had to advance inland. They had to get off that beach and into the hedgerow country beyond. And to do that, they had to cross the causeway. The first soldier to try the official route didn't make it far. Machining and fire swept across the causeway, and he fell, his body crumpling like a discarded uniform. Others tried to follow, but the fire was too intense, too accurate. Officers screamed orders that couldn't be heard over the sound of combat. Soldiers became separated from their units. Panic threatened to turn chase into catastrophe. That was when Sham moved. He had positioned himself and his team, Kirkwood, Rothstein, Webb, and 12 other men who had chosen to trust him, at a point where the rope system was hidden beneath brush and concealing material. As soldiers fleeing the beach and searching desperately for a way forward began to gather, Sam emerged from his position. "This way," he called. "Follow the rope. Keep your hands on the rope and move. Don't stop. Keep moving." Soldiers, desperate and disoriented, began to follow. At first, it was just a handful. Then dozens. Then hundreds. They came in groups, individually, in pairs, all of them traumatized by what they had endured on the beach, all of them looking for any way forward that didn't mean certain death. The rope system held. Soldiers moved across the causeway in what seemed like supernatural order, given the chase surrounding them. Where there should have been bottlenecks and gridlock, there was movement. Where there should have been soldiers fleeing or becoming lost, there was purposeful advance. Sham stood at the entrance to the causeway, giving directions, encouraging stragglers, his voice steady and clear. "Keep your hand on the rope. The rope will take you through. Trust the rope. Keep moving." Some soldiers, especially those from other units, asked him his name, thanked him profusely, offered him words of gratitude. Sham barely registered these interactions. His entire being was focused on one mission, getting as many men as possible off the causeway and into the relative safety of the inland position. German artillery attempted to target the causeway several times, But the rope system's low profile and the soldiers' distributed spacing made it less of a target than the packed formations the Germans had expected. The casualties, horrifying by any standard, were nonetheless far lower than they would have been without the rope system. By the end of the day, over 3 soldiers had successfully crossed the causeway at Ida Beach using Sam's rope system, soldiers who, in another timeline, might have been cut down trying to cross in the disorganized fashion that the original plan would have required. If this story has moved you and made you think differently about history, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story like this. These narratives deserve to be heard. The official reports filed after day made no mention of Sam Jackson or his rope system. The causeway crossing was noted as successful, and credit was given to the planning of the overall operation and the bravery of the soldiers who crossed it. The engineering corps took credit for the logistics strategy. Senior officers received commendations. Sam Jackson continued his work quietly. He was transferred to another assignment after the beachhead was established, shipped to another theater of operations where his services were again considered useful but his insights were considered dispensable. He remained in the army after the war, achieving the rank of major before his retirement in 1948, a significant achievement for a black officer in that era, though overshadowed by the achievements and promotions of his white colleagues. Few people knew what Sam had done on June 5, 1948. The soldiers he had guided were scattered across the continent, discharged after the war to return to their civilian lives. Some remembered the tall black engineer who had guided them across the causeway. Many did not. The war created so many heroes that those who served without fanfare or official recognition were easy to forget. In 1952, Sam Jackson opened a small construction company in Atlanta. He was successful, but not wealthy. He was respected in his community, but unknown to the wider world. He married, had 3 children, and led a quiet life of faith and steady work. He died in 1987, at the age of 73, in a hospital in Atlanta. His obituary appeared in the local newspaper, noting his military service and his business career. It made no mention of the rope system or the soldiers who had lived because of his intervention. Years later, long after his death, historians would begin to piece together what had actually happened at Ida Beach on June 5, 1948. They would find Sam's old written reports, filed away in the archives. They would interview elderly veterans who remembered the rope system. They would discover that what had been dismissed as impractical and unnecessary had actually been crucial to the success of the operation. But by then, Sam Jackson was long gone, and the world's recognition came too late to mean anything to him. Yet perhaps that was never the point. Sam's faith had sustained him throughout his life because he believed something that the modern world often forgets, that doing the right thing, serving faithfully in your appointed place, and trusting in God's providence doesn't require the applause of the crowd. It doesn't require official recognition or monuments or history books. It requires only faithfulness. In Matthew 25:21, Jesus tells the parable of the talents and says to the faithful servant, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." Sam had been faithful. On that beach, in that moment, with lives hanging in the balance, he had done what was right and what was necessary. He had trusted that God had placed him there for a reason, and he had acted accordingly. The recognition of man never came in his lifetime. But perhaps something greater did. The soldiers whose lives were spared because of Sam's rope system went on to have families. They had children, and those children had children. Doctors were born, teachers were born, artists and scientists and good people of all kinds were born because their grandfathers survived a causeway at Normandy. Entire legacies of goodness and life flowed from that on a moment of faithful action. The rope system itself was eventually standardized and used in other amphibious operations throughout the Pacific theater. It saved countless more lives, but the name of the man who invented it was never mentioned in the official histories. Sam Jackson lived and died as a man of quiet dignity, never bitter about the recognition that never came, secure in the knowledge that he had done his duty. His gravestone in a cemetery near Atlanta bears no inscription about day or his engineering innovations. It simply reads his name, his dates, and his passage from the Bible. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. He had built many houses in his lifetime, literal ones with his construction company, and figurative ones through his faithful service. He knew the truth of that passage. And in that knowledge, he found peace. The world has largely forgotten Sam Jackson. But God remembers. And perhaps that, for a man of faith, is enough. Thank you for watching this story. If it's reminded you that greatness isn't always recognized in real time, and that faith and faithfulness matter more than fame, please subscribe to this channel and hit like so we can continue bringing you these overlooked stories. Comment below, what does faithfulness mean to you? In 2015, a historian named Patricia Morrison published a book titled, Unseen Heroes, The Untold Stories of African American Engineers in World War I. It contained a full chapter on Sam Jackson and his rope system. The book found a modest audience among military history enthusiasts and scholars. But by then, Sam's 3 children were elderly themselves. His grandchildren read about their grandfather's achievements for the first time, learning a truth about their family history that had been largely absent from dinner table conversations for 70 years. At a military history conference in Washington, D.C., Morrison presented his research on Sam Jackson. A handful of elderly veterans in the audience, now in their 90s, stood up to share their own recollections of crossing the causeway, of following the rope, of hearing the voice of the tall black engineer telling them to keep moving. "He saved my life," sighed an old soldier, his voice wavering with emotion. "I didn't know his name until today, but I've thought about him for 70 years." The rope system that Sam Jackson designed has since been recognized by military engineers as an innovation ahead of its time. Training manuals now cite his work. Academic papers study his methodology. Universities have created scholarships in his name. But Sam himself never knew any of this. He lived and died as he had lived most of his life, faithfully, quietly, without seeking recognition. He trusted in the Lord, did his duty, and left the results in God's hands. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of his life, that faithfulness matters more than fame, that duty matters more than recognition, and that God's purposes are often fulfilled through those whom the world has forgotten or dismissed. The rope system saved ek, Schwinn soldiers on June 5, 1944. But Sam Jackson's real legacy is not in the lives he saved directly, but in the example he set of what it means to live with faith, integrity, and purpose, regardless of whether the world notices. And that legacy, unlike the man himself, will never be forgotten.